The rain hammered against the windows of the Mancini estate like 1,000 angry fists demanding entry. It was November in New York, and the city wore its coldest face. Grey skies stretched endlessly over concrete and steel, while the Hudson River churned dark and restless below the cliffs of New Jersey. Inside the sprawling villa that overlooked the water, silence had replaced the laughter and power that once echoed through its marble halls. Sophia Mancini stood alone in her father's study, a room that still smelled of aged leather, Cuban cigars, and the faint metallic tang of old violence. She was 28 years old, dressed in black from neck to ankle, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. Her green eyes, her mother's eyes, reflected none of the warmth that might have softened her features. Instead, they held something colder, something calculated. Don Alessandro Mancini had been dead for 3 weeks. 17 bullets had torn through his body outside a restaurant in Little Italy, a neighborhood he had ruled like a king for 30 years. The newspapers called it a gang war. The police called it inevitable. The underworld called it opportunity. Sophia called it inheritance. She ran her fingers along the edge of her father's mahogany desk, feeling the grooves where his rings had scratched the surface over decades of deals, threats, and executions ordered with the casual wave of a hand. This desk had witnessed the construction of an empire built on fear, blood, and absolute loyalty. From this chair, Alessandro Mancini had controlled everything: the docks, the unions, the judges, the politicians. He had been a god in a world where gods were made of violence and silence. But gods die, and when they do, their kingdoms are devoured by wolves. Already the vultures were circling. The Castellano family had moved on 3 of their warehouses in Brooklyn. The Russians were pushing into their territory in Brighton Beach, and worst of all, the captains, her father's own men, were beginning to whisper. A woman, they said. A girl who grew up in boarding schools and European universities. What did she know about running an empire built on broken bones and buried bodies? Sophia knew they expected her to fail. They expected her to sell off pieces of her father's legacy to the highest bidder and disappear into a comfortable life of inherited wealth. They expected her to be weak. They had no idea how wrong they were. She opened the drawer of the desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, not the one the accountants used, but the real one. The one that listed every politician on the payroll, every judge who owed a favor, every captain who had skimmed money and thought Alessandro hadn't noticed. Her father had been many things, but careless was not one of them. He had taught her that knowledge was more powerful than any gun, that information could destroy a man faster than a bullet. And he had taught her one more thing: never let them see you bleed. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, belonging to a man who had walked through this house since before she was born. Vincent Caruso, her father's underboss. A man built like a building, with hands that had broken more bones than she could count, and a loyalty that ran so deep it had become a religion. He had been her father's right hand, his enforcer, his confessor, and now he stood in the doorway, waiting for her to acknowledge him. When she finally turned, she saw the doubt in his eyes. Not open defiance, Vincent was too smart for that, but uncertainty. He was a soldier trying to decide whether to follow orders from a general he didn't trust. She didn't give him time to decide. Over the next hour, in that rain-soaked study, Sophia laid out her vision with the precision of a surgeon. She showed Vincent the ledger. She explained with cold clarity exactly which captains had been stealing, which families were planning to move against them, and which politicians were about to turn state's witness. She outlined a plan that would consolidate power, eliminate threats, and transform the Mancini Empire from a dying dinosaur into something new, something the old guard couldn't even imagine. She didn't ask for his loyalty. She demonstrated why giving it was his only intelligent option. When Vincent left that night, the doubt in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Not quite respect, not yet, but recognition. The kind of recognition a wolf gives another wolf when it realizes the pack has a new alpha. Sophia returned to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears the house refused to cry. Below, the city sprawled in all its brutal magnificence, millions of lives intersecting, colliding, destroying and creating in an endless dance of survival. Her father had controlled a piece of this city through fear and tradition. She would control it through something far more dangerous: intelligence, strategy, and the willingness to burn everything to the ground if necessary. The first move had been made. The game had begun. And Sophia Mancini was no longer just the daughter of a dead don. She was something the underworld had never seen before, a woman who understood that the old rules had died with her father, and that the future belonged to whoever was ruthless enough to seize it. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning splitting the sky over Manhattan like the city itself was breaking open. But inside the villa, Sophia stood perfectly still, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. Let them come, she thought. Let them all come. They would learn soon enough that Alessandro Mancini's greatest creation wasn't his empire, it was his daughter. Winter descended on New York like a fist closing around the city's throat. By December, the streets were slick with ice and dirty snow, and the wind cut through the avenues with a cruelty that matched the mood of the underworld. The Mancini empire was being tested, and everyone wanted to see if Sophia would break. She didn't. In the 6 weeks since her father's death, she had moved with the calculated precision of a chess master playing against opponents who were still learning the rules. The Castellano family had taken 3 warehouses in Brooklyn. Sophia had taken back 2 and burned the third to the ground, with $2 million of their heroin inside. The Russians had pushed into Brighton Beach. Sophia had met with their Pakan in a neutral restaurant, presented him with photographs of his mistress and illegitimate children, and negotiated a treaty that gave her 20% of their gambling operations. The captains who had doubted her were now divided. Some had come to heel, recognizing that she possessed her father's mind without his need for theatrical violence. Others remained skeptical, waiting for her to make a mistake they could exploit. But it was the third group that worried her most, the silent ones, the ones who smiled and nodded and swore loyalty while sharpening their knives in the darkness. Men like Luca Moretti. Luca had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. He was the son of her father's consigliere, raised in the same world of codes and consequences that had shaped her own childhood. While other children played with toys, they had played with concepts of loyalty, honor, and the cost of betrayal. While teenagers worried about prom dates, they had attended sit-downs and learned to read the subtle language of power. And somewhere along the way, during the years when she was away at university and he was working his way up through her father's organization, something had shifted between them. The childhood friendship had evolved into something more complex, more dangerous. By the time she returned to New York permanently, 3 years before her father's death, she and Luca had become lovers, though in their world, love was always secondary to loyalty, and loyalty was always tested. He was 32 now, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of charisma that made people want to follow him, and the kind of intelligence that made her father trust him with sensitive operations. He ran the family's legitimate businesses, the construction companies, the waste management contracts, the consulting firms that laundered money through layers of corporate complexity. He was clean on paper, which made him invaluable, and he was the only person in her world who had ever seen her as something other than Alessandro Mancini's daughter, which was exactly why she couldn't trust him. Trust, her father had taught her, was a luxury afforded only to the already defeated. The moment you truly trusted someone was the moment you gave them the power to destroy you. So Sophia watched, and she waited, and she began to notice things. Money was disappearing from their accounts, not large amounts, but consistent ones, small enough to be explained as operating costs, large enough to matter when you added them up over months. Information was leaking to their competitors, meeting locations, shipment schedules, the names of police officers on the payroll. Again, nothing catastrophic, but enough to create problems, to make her look incompetent, to give the doubters ammunition. She could have confronted Luca directly, could have brought Vincent and 2 other soldiers to his apartment and demanded answers with guns drawn. That was how her father would have handled it, swift, brutal, final. But Sophia was not her father. Instead, she created a trap so elegant that even she had to admire its architecture. She began feeding Luca false information through channels he believed were secure. She told him, in confidence during one of their increasingly rare, intimate moments, that she was planning to move a major heroin shipment through the port of Newark on a specific date. She showed him documents, forged, of course, and made sure he understood the stakes. This shipment, she explained, would fund their expansion into legitimate real estate development. It was the key to everything. Then she watched to see what he would do. The answer came 3 days before the scheduled shipment. The DEA, acting on an anonymous tip, raided the port of Newark with enough agents to invade a small country. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But their presence confirmed what Sophia had suspected. Luca was selling her secrets to her enemies. The why of it didn't matter. Maybe he genuinely believed she was too weak to lead and was trying to force her out for the good of the organization. Maybe one of her rivals had gotten to him with promises of power or money. Maybe he resented being overlooked, believing that as the son of the consigliere and the deceased Don's protégé, he should have inherited the empire instead of the daughter who had spent years away from the family business. The why was irrelevant. Only the what mattered, and what Luca had done was unforgivable. But Sophia didn't move against him immediately. Instead, she did something that demonstrated the fundamental difference between her leadership and her father's. She began to systematically isolate him. She promoted other young members of the organization, giving them responsibilities and respect. She held private meetings with the captains, individually and in small groups, building relationships and demonstrating competence. She made deals that brought in money and expanded influence, and slowly, carefully, she allowed word to spread about the trap she had set, about the false information and the DEA raid that found nothing. The message was clear without ever being spoken. Someone in the inner circle was a traitor, and Sophia Mancini was smart enough to catch them. By the time January arrived, Luca's position had become untenable. The other captains avoided him. His phone calls went unreturned. Even his own crew began to distance themselves, sensing the shift in the wind. And through it all, Sophia continued to see him privately, continued to let him believe that whatever suspicions existed, they didn't extend to him. She played the role of the woman in love, the leader who trusted her partner absolutely. It was the cruelest thing she had ever done. On a bitter cold night when the temperature dropped below freezing and ice formed on the inside of windows, Sophia invited Luca to the villa. She told him they needed to talk about their future, both professional and personal. She wore a dress the color of blood and greeted him with a kiss that tasted like goodbye. They sat in her father's study, her study now, with glasses of expensive scotch and the fire crackling in the fireplace. For a moment, it almost felt like it had in the beginning, when the weight of the empire wasn't yet on her shoulders and the world still held possibilities beyond power and survival. Then Sophia set down her glass and told him she knew everything. The color drained from Luca's face, but to his credit, he didn't try to lie. Instead, he made his case. He talked about tradition, about how the old families would never fully accept her, about how his betrayal had been pragmatic rather than personal. He even suggested they could still work together, that his connections to her rivals could be turned into an asset if she was willing to forgive and adapt. He didn't understand that forgiveness required mercy, and Sophia Mancini had learned long ago that mercy was just another word for weakness. She stood and walked to the window, the same window where she had watched the rain the night her father died. Now snow was falling, covering the city in white silence. When she turned back to Luca, her face was a mask of perfect calm. She didn't have him killed. That would have been easy, expected, satisfying in its simplicity. Instead, she made him an offer that was far worse than death. She would let him live, would even let him keep a small, legitimate business to support himself. But he would leave New York. He would sever all ties with the organization. And he would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had been beaten not by violence, but by the superior intelligence of the woman he had underestimated. In their world, that kind of humiliation was worse than any bullet. Luca left that night, and Sophia never saw him again. But his absence taught the organization a lesson that no amount of violence could have conveyed. Alessandro Mancini had ruled through fear. His daughter ruled through something far more terrifying. The ability to see 10 moves ahead and the willingness to sacrifice anything, including her own heart, to win the game. By the time spring arrived, bringing weak sunlight to the grey city, the whispers about Sophia Mancini had changed. No one called her a girl anymore. No one questioned her right to sit in her father's chair. They had a new name for her now, spoken with a mixture of respect and fear: La Regina, the Queen. Summer came to New York with oppressive heat and humidity that turned the city into a sweltering concrete jungle. The air conditioners struggled, the subway platforms became furnaces, and tempers frayed in the relentless sun. But for Sophia Mancini, the heat was just another element to endure, another challenge to overcome in her transformation of her father's empire. It had been 9 months since Alessandro's death, and the organization he had built over 3 decades was now almost unrecognizable. Sophia had done what everyone thought impossible. She had not only held the empire together, but had begun to fundamentally reshape it into something the old guard could barely comprehend. The street-level operations remained, of course. The gambling, the protection rackets, the loan sharking, the controlled vice that had always been the foundation of Mafia power. Vincent Caruso still oversaw these traditional enterprises with the same brutal efficiency he had demonstrated under her father. But now they were just the beginning, the cash-generating engine that funded something far more ambitious. Sophia was building legitimacy. She had used the family's construction companies to bid on city contracts, leveraging political connections her father had cultivated but never fully exploited. She had invested in technology startups in Brooklyn and Queens, becoming a silent partner in companies that would eventually be worth hundreds of millions. She had purchased struggling real estate throughout the city, anticipating the gentrification patterns that were already transforming neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Bushwick. Most importantly, she had established a private equity firm, Mancini Capital Partners, that allowed her to invest the organization's money in legitimate businesses across the country. On paper, she was just another young executive, Harvard-educated and well-connected, riding the wave of New York's financial renaissance. In reality, she was washing decades of dirty money through layers of corporate complexity that would take federal investigators years to untangle. Her father had controlled blocks. She was positioning herself to control industries. The transformation hadn't been easy. The old captains resented the changes, missed the simplicity of their father's era, when problems were solved with baseball bats and bodies were dumped in the river. They grumbled about the meetings with lawyers and accountants, about the complicated financial instruments that replaced simple cash transactions, about having to wear suits and pretend to be businessmen instead of soldiers. But they couldn't argue with the results. Money was flowing into the organization at unprecedented levels. More importantly, the attention from law enforcement had decreased dramatically. The FBI still surveilled them, of course, But Sophia's legitimate operations provided excellent cover. It was hard to build a RICO case against someone who spent most of her time in board meetings and charity galas. Vincent remained her most valuable asset. The old soldier had fully committed to her leadership, seeing in her vision something he hadn't possessed the imagination to create himself. He understood his role, to be the fist while she was the brain, to handle the bloody necessities while she built the future. Together, they formed a partnership that combined the best of the old world and the new. But power, Sophia was learning, came with its own unique form of loneliness. She spent her days in glass-walled offices in Midtown, negotiating deals with executives who had no idea they were working with the daughter of a Mafia don. She spent her evenings at her villa, reviewing reports and planning strategies in the same study where her father had once plotted murders. And she spent her nights alone, lying awake and wondering if the empire she was building was worth the pieces of herself she had sacrificed to create it. The incident with Luca had taught her a brutal lesson. Love was a liability. Trust was a weakness. Anyone who got close enough to see her vulnerable was close enough to destroy her. So she kept everyone at a distance, maintaining relationships that were transactional rather than emotional, strategic rather than personal. It was effective. It was necessary. It was absolutely exhausting. By August, she had reached a critical juncture. The Mancini empire was strong enough to survive, but not yet powerful enough to be untouchable. She needed one major victory, one transformative deal that would cement her position not just as the heir to her father's criminal organization, but as a legitimate force in New York's business world. The opportunity came from an unexpected source, a meeting with Marcus Chen, a Chinese-American developer who controlled significant real estate interests throughout Manhattan. Chen was planning the construction of a massive mixed-use development in Hudson Yards, a project that would include luxury apartments, commercial space, and a hotel. He needed capital and political connections. Sophia had both, but Chen was no fool. He knew who Sophia was, or at least had a good idea of her family's history. The question was whether he would be willing to work with her despite, or perhaps because of, that knowledge. They met at a restaurant in Tribeca, a place expensive enough to ensure privacy, but not so ostentatious as to attract attention. Chen was in his mid-50s, grey-haired and impeccably dressed, with the careful manner of someone who had built an empire through patience and calculated risk-taking. The negotiation took 3 hours. Chen wanted to know what Sophia brought to the table beyond capital. She showed him her portfolio of political connections, the unions she could influence, the regulatory obstacles she could help navigate. She demonstrated with cold precision exactly how valuable her particular skill set could be to someone trying to build in a city where every project required 100 approvals and 1,000 compromises. Chen asked her directly about her father's reputation, about the violence and criminality that had built the Mancini name. She didn't deny it. Instead, she explained that she represented a new generation, one that understood that real power in the 21st century came not from controlling streets, but from controlling capital, not from inspiring fear, but from providing value. By the time dessert arrived, they had the outline of a deal. Mancini Capital Partners would invest $50 million in the Hudson Yards project. In return, Sophia would receive a significant equity stake and a seat on the project's board. More importantly, she would gain legitimacy, a public association with one of New York's most respected developers. It was exactly what she needed. But as September arrived and the contracts were being finalized, complications emerged. The FBI had opened a new investigation into the Mancini organization. Nothing concrete, but enough surveillance and pressure to make Chen nervous. He was a legitimate businessman. He couldn't afford to be publicly associated with organized crime. The deal was in jeopardy, and with it, Sophia's entire strategy for legitimization. She could have walked away. could have accepted that some bridges between the criminal and legitimate worlds couldn't be crossed. But that would have meant accepting limits. And Sophia Mancini had not come this far by accepting anything. Instead, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would give the FBI what they wanted, but on her terms. Working through intermediaries and lawyers, she provided information that led to the arrest of 3 captains in rival organizations. Not her people, but competitors who had been problems anyway. The information was valuable enough to make the FBI happy, but carefully calibrated to avoid implicating anyone in her own organization. It was the ultimate betrayal of the old code. Cooperating with law enforcement, even indirectly, even against enemies, was unforgivable in her father's world. If the old guard ever found out, it would destroy her credibility and possibly her life. But Sophia understood something her father never had. The old code was dead. It had died with him, with the generation of men who valued honor more than survival, who would rather go to prison than adapt to a changing world. She was building something new, something that didn't fit into the old categories of criminal and legitimate, legal and illegal. She was creating an empire that existed in the gray spaces, that moved seamlessly between boardrooms and backrooms, that used whatever tools were necessary to survive and thrive. The FBI backed off. The investigation stalled and eventually went quiet. And in October, as leaves turned gold and red in Central Park, Marcus Chen shook Sophia's hand in a crowded press conference announcing the Hudson Yards development. She stood there in a designer suit, smiling for cameras, answering questions about economic development and urban revitalization. To the reporters and business leaders in attendance, she was just another young executive. Another example of New York's endless capacity for reinvention. None of them knew that she had just accomplished something no member of her father's generation had ever achieved. She had moved from the shadows into the light, had transformed dirty money into clean capital, had become legitimate without giving up power. That night, alone in her study, Sophia poured herself a drink of her father's scotch and looked out at the city she was learning to control in ways he never imagined. The lights stretched endlessly in every direction, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. She had built an empire, but the question that kept her awake as the night grew deeper was simple and devastating. What had she become in the process? Winter returned to New York with a vengeance, bringing the coldest December in 50 years. The city hardened under layers of ice, and the wind off the Atlantic cut through the streets like sharpened steel. It had been 18 months since Alessandro Mancini's death, and his daughter had done the impossible. She had not only survived, but had fundamentally transformed what it meant to be a Mancini. But empires, Sophia was learning, were never truly secure. They existed in a constant state of siege, defended against enemies without and wrought within. And just when she thought she had consolidated power, when she thought she had moved beyond the violent chaos of her father's world, the past came back with devastating force. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. Vincent's voice on the other end, stripped of its usual confidence, telling her she needed to come to the villa immediately. Something in his tone made her cancel her morning meetings and drive out to the estate in New Jersey, her hands tight on the wheel as anxiety coiled in her stomach. When she arrived, Vincent was waiting in the study with 3 other soldiers, their faces grim. On the desk was a file, thin, worn, clearly old. Inside were photographs, documents, and a USB drive containing video files. Luca Moretti had resurfaced, and he had brought evidence that could destroy everything she had built. Sophia's hands remained steady as she examined the contents, but inside she felt something crack. The file contained documentation of her deal with the FBI, not complete, but enough. Photographs of her meeting with federal agents, audio recordings of conversations with intermediaries, and most damaging of all, evidence of the information she had provided that led to the arrest of rival captains. In the world she came from, this was proof of the ultimate sin. Cooperation with law enforcement, regardless of the reasons or the targets, was an automatic death sentence. If this information became public within the organization, if the old guard learned what she had done, her authority would evaporate. The captains who had accepted her leadership would turn against her. The empire she had built would collapse, and she would be lucky to escape with her life. But the file hadn't been released yet. That was the key. Luca hadn't gone public with it. Instead, he had sent it to Vincent first, along with a message. He wanted a meeting. He wanted to negotiate. He wanted to come home. The irony wasn't lost on Sophia. She had exiled him with the expectation that he would disappear into obscurity, that the humiliation of his defeat would keep him quiet and distant. Instead, he had spent the last year building his own power base, collecting evidence and waiting for the right moment to strike. Now he held a weapon that could destroy her, and he was offering her a choice. Let him return to the organization with a position of power, give him a seat at the table and a share of the empire, or refuse and watch as he distributed the evidence to every captain, every soldier, every enemy who would love to see the queen brought low. It was the kind of trap her father would have recognized immediately. Alessandro would have handled it simply. Send Vincent and a team to wherever Luca was hiding, kill him, destroy the evidence, and bury the whole problem in an unmarked grave. But Sophia couldn't do that. Not because she lacked the ruthlessness. 18 months of leadership had taught her to make hard choices without hesitation, but because Luca was too smart to be vulnerable to such a simple solution. He wouldn't have reached out unless he had insurance, unless he had set up a dead man's switch that would release the evidence if anything happened to him. She was trapped in a game of chess with an opponent who knew her too well, who understood how she thought and how she would likely respond. And the stakes were everything she had sacrificed, everything she had become, everything she had built from the ashes of her father's violent legacy. Vincent waited for her decision, his massive presence somehow reassuring in its solidity. He didn't know the full details of what the file contained. She had made sure to keep that information compartmentalized, but he knew it was serious, knew it threatened their position, and he trusted her to find a solution. Sophia made her decision with the cold calculation that had become her defining characteristic. She would meet with Luca, but it would be on her terms, at a location of her choosing, and with preparations that would give her options regardless of how the confrontation unfolded. She chose her father's villa for the meeting, the same estate where she had first stood in the rain, and decided to seize her inheritance. It was symbolic, perhaps foolishly so, but Sophia had learned that symbols mattered in her world. They shaped narratives, influenced perceptions, and gave meaning to the brutal realities of power. The meeting was set for the following Saturday, deep in the evening when darkness would have settled completely over the grounds. Sophia spent the days beforehand preparing with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her entire transformation of the organization. She reviewed every possible scenario, planned for every contingency, and made sure that whatever happened, she would maintain control. Luca arrived exactly on time, walking through the gates he had passed through 1,000 times before. He looked different, leaner, harder, with something in his eyes that hadn't been there 18 months ago. Exile had changed him, had burned away whatever softness remained, and left only the essential core of who he was. A survivor, just like her. They met in the study, the room that had witnessed so many moments of transformation in Sophia's life. Vincent was present, standing by the door like a sentinel. Luca had brought no one, a calculated demonstration of either confidence or vulnerability. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two people who had once shared intimacy and trust, now separated by betrayal, exile, and the cruel mathematics of power. Luca spoke first. He didn't make threats or demands. Instead, he laid out his proposal with the same strategic intelligence that had made him valuable in the first place. He acknowledged what he had done, the information he had sold to Sophia's enemies. He explained that his actions had come from a genuine belief that she wasn't ready to lead, that the organization would be destroyed under her command. He admitted he had been wrong. The empire she had built, the transformation she had engineered, it had exceeded anything he thought possible. She had proven herself not just capable, but visionary, not just surviving, but thriving in ways that redefined what their world could be. Now, he wanted back in, not out of nostalgia or sentiment, but because he recognized that being part of what she was building was better than being outside watching it succeed without him. He offered his skills, his intelligence, his absolute loyalty going forward, and in exchange he would destroy the evidence he had collected and never speak of it again. It was a reasonable offer. It was even, in its own way, logical. Luca was talented, connected, and demonstrably resourceful. Having him inside the organization where she could watch him was arguably safer than having him outside as a potential threat. But Sophia hadn't survived by accepting reasonable offers. She had survived by understanding that in her world, mercy was a luxury that eventually got you killed. She told Luca a story. She spoke about the months after her father's death, about the captains who had doubted her, about the enemies who had moved against the organization believing it would collapse. She described the loneliness of leadership, the impossibility of trust, the way power required sacrificing pieces of yourself until you weren't sure what remained. And then she told him about the decision she had made when she provided information to the FBI. She explained that she had crossed a line that no one in her father's generation would have crossed, that she had violated the old code because the old code was a relic of a dying world. The empire she had built, she said, wasn't based on the traditions her father had honored. It was based on a single principle: do whatever is necessary to survive and win. No rules, no codes, no loyalties, except to power itself. Luca had betrayed her once. He claimed he had learned his lesson, that he would be loyal going forward. But Sophia had learned her own lessons during the 18 months since her father's death. She had learned that trust was impossible, that everyone would betray you if the price was right, that the only way to be safe was to be untouchable. She made Luca a counteroffer. She would let him live, would not send Vincent after him or hunt him down, but he would leave New York permanently. He would move to another city, another state, far enough away that he couldn't be a factor in her world. And he would destroy the evidence he had collected, would do it right there in the study while she watched. If he refused, if he tried to release the information or threaten her in any way, she would destroy him. Not quickly, not mercifully, but systematically. She would use every resource at her disposal to dismantle his life piece by piece until there was nothing left. She spoke with absolute calm, with the cold certainty of someone who had already decided and would not be moved by appeals to sentiment or history, or whatever they had once meant to each other. Luca listened, and in his eyes, Sophia saw the moment when he realized who she had become. Not the woman he had loved or the girl he had grown up with, but something else entirely, something that couldn't be threatened or manipulated or appealed to through emotion. She had become exactly what her father had been, but more dangerous because she wore legitimacy like armor and wielded intelligence like a weapon sharper than any gun. The video files and documents burned in the fireplace while Vincent watched impassively. Luca signed papers that had been prepared by lawyers, contracts that bound him legally to his exile, and made sure he understood the consequences of violating their agreement. When it was done, when there was nothing left but ashes and signatures, Luca stood to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Sophia, still sitting behind her father's desk. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't apologize again or make promises about staying away. Instead, he spoke 3 words that hit harder than any threat could have. "You're alone now." Then he was gone, walking out of the villa and out of her life for the second and final time. Sophia sat in the silence that followed, staring at the ashes in the fireplace. Vincent remained by the door, waiting for orders or reassurance or whatever she needed from him. But she had nothing to say. She stood and walked to the window, the same window where she had stood so many times over the past 18 months. The city spread below her, glittering and vast and full of possibilities and dangers. She controlled more of it now than her father had ever dreamed of controlling. She had built an empire that spanned from street corners to boardrooms, from illegal gambling to legitimate real estate, from her father's violent world to something new and undefined. She had won every battle, had defeated every enemy, had transformed herself from the daughter of a don into something unprecedented. A woman who commanded respect and fear in a world that had never accepted women as anything but wives and daughters. But Luca's final words echoed in her mind, mixing with the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of burning evidence in the fireplace. "You're alone now." She thought about the sacrifices she had made, the relationships she had destroyed or prevented, the parts of herself she had cut away because they made her vulnerable. The life she might have had if she had chosen differently, if she had sold her father's empire and disappeared into comfortable obscurity. Was it worth it? Was power worth the loneliness that came with it? Was winning the game worth losing everything else? She didn't know, and perhaps that uncertainty was the final proof that she had truly become what she needed to be. Because doubt was a luxury afforded only to those who still had something to lose. And Sophia Mancini had lost everything except her empire months ago. Her reflection stared back at her from the window glass, a woman in her late 20s who looked older, harder, with green eyes that held no warmth or mercy. Behind her reflection, the city glittered like a crown made of light and shadow. The daughter of a don had become a queen. She ruled an empire built not on her father's violence, but on her own intelligence, ruthlessness, and willingness to sacrifice everything for power. She had broken every rule, violated every code, and done whatever was necessary to survive in a world that had tried to destroy her, and she had won. But as she stood there in the silence of her victory, staring at her reflection and the empire it represented, Sophia Mancini finally understood the price of winning. She understood what her father had known all along, what every person who sought absolute power eventually learned. The throne was always cold, the crown was always heavy, and the queen was always inevitably completely alone. Thank you for joining us on Sophia's journey from the daughter of a mafia don to the queen of an empire built on intelligence, strategy, and sacrifice. Her story reminds us that power comes with costs, that transformation requires leaving pieces of yourself behind, and that victory is sometimes indistinguishable from loss. If you enjoyed this story of ambition, betrayal, and the price of power, please subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives that explore the human experience in all its complexity. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on Sophia's choices. Was her transformation necessary, or did she lose too much in her pursuit of power? We'd love to hear your perspective. Hit the notification bell to be alerted when we release our next story. And remember, in the game of power, there are no perfect choices, only survivors. Until next time.